Okay, hello, welcome to the third in our little trilogy of update videos looking at the impact of government subsidies on markets. So in this video, we're going to evaluate some of the benefits, the justifications, and also some of the risks and the costs, the drawbacks of government intervention in the form of subsidy. Quick reminder, building on the first two videos, that a subsidy is any form of government support, nearly always financial, offered to a producer, sometimes occasionally a consumer. Subsidies to suppliers, to producers, be they a manufacturer, a grower of a product, they reduce the marginal cost of supply, bring prices down and hopefully increase the quantity bought and sold. Well, when might subsidies be justified as a form of government intervention in a market? Keep in mind a subsidy is a way of changing the allocation of resources. In theory, it brings the price down, as shown by this diagram, fall in price and a higher quantity demanded at the new equilibrium, and the subsidy, the scale of the financial support, is shown by the vertical distance between two supply curves. So when might subsidies be justified as a form of intervention? Well, there's loads of good examples. I think we've been in the first video of subsidies in action. Oftentimes these justifications are built around equity and efficiency and addressing market failures. So, for example, helping relatively poor families with food and childcare, particularly during difficult economic times, could justify that on social grounds, on grounds of equity and fairness. Subsidies for food, for example, might improve nutrition, which can over the long term improve productivity and also bring down the cost, the burden on health services. Subsidies used increasingly in the energy sector, so in trying to encourage investment in renewable energy through feed-in tariffs, and also generally trying to encourage research and innovation and investment in other fledgling sectors, potentially fast-growing industries, including life sciences. So government subsidies, for example, of vaccine research and vaccine production would be a super example to use in 2021. Oftentimes governments justify subsidies on macroeconomic grounds. They want to protect jobs, particularly in industries hit by recession or by some other form of economic shock which is threatening their commercial viability. Another equity efficiency issue is to try to address affordability. So using subsidies to improve housing and transport affordability to improve the mobility of labour, to improve labour market outcomes and perhaps address structural unemployment. And linked to that, subsidies to lower the cost of both training and taking on employing workers in the labour market. So subsidies to help bring more people back into work, particularly those who've been out of a job for a sustained lengthy period. And of course there's a social aspect as well of things like the subsidising the arts, the cultural services, libraries, museums, theatre, music and literature, which are widely regarded as having significant positive externalities or social benefits. So just bringing these points together in one slide, subsidies nearly always justified on grounds of helping to correct one or more market failures, protecting jobs during economic downturns, improving a country's export potential, addressing inequalities both of income and consumption. So measures to make things more affordable, particularly to lower income families, can help address issues of consumption inequality. Subsidies to drive long-term innovation and growth, and also change the pattern of spending, for example, moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, moving away from diesel cars towards hybrid and electric vehicles. However, of course, as you know, in economics, you've always got to evaluate. So whilst there might be some significant justifications for subsidies, there are some disadvantages, some drawbacks, some risks, some costs of government subsidising. First argument is that producers can become subsidy dependent, overly dependent on subsidy perhaps. Perhaps an example of that would be farming, or maybe a subsidy offered to a steel maker, where the subsidy itself can create some problems in the sense that producers, perhaps their productivity suffers because they know they're going to be in receipt of a generous subsidy. And of course that can add to the long-term cost faced by taxpayers. Subsidies in the form of export minimum prices and other forms of financial support can often lead to excess production, surpluses of goods and services. That can lead to allocative inefficiency. We're producing more than we actually need or want. And the famous example, of course, of this is the butter mountains and wine lakes associated with the European Union Common Agricultural Policy. Many free market economists argue that subsidy is a form of government failure, that the highest subsidies often go to industries and agents with the strongest political lobbying power, the ability to influence politicians, and that can lead to government failure. Subsidies can distort resource allocation, so anti-subsidy economists believe that the free market, the price mechanism, is ultimately the best arbiter of allocating scarce resources amongst competing uses. And if you offer a production subsidy, that can generate its own environmental consequences. So, for example, perhaps if you subsidise fertilisers and things, that can lead to extensive overuse of fertilisers in intensive farming, can damage yields in the long term. If you subsidise the fishing sector, for example, that could lead to too big a catch, threatening long-term sustainability. So there could be some externalities from excessive production. And of course, ultimately, subsidies are not a free lunch. If you go back to our second video, can you visualise that diagram showing the cost of a subsidy to the government? Well, that can be a very expensive process, and in some countries, fossil fuel subsidies in China are nearly $40 billion a year. Fossil fuel subsidies in India, $17 billion a year. Subsidies can be very expensive, and ultimately taxpayers bear the cost, and these might be taxpayers who've received no benefit at all from the subsidy. Quick review. I just want to pick out in this evaluation session some sort of key questions you might want to think about when evaluating subsidy. If you get a question on subsidy in assignments, perhaps ask these three questions. First of all, are the subsidies effective in meeting their aims? So will a subsidy actually achieve a desired stimulus to demand and consumption? Of course, that depends in part on the price elasticity of demand, which we covered in the second video. Is a subsidy on its own enough? Is lowering a price enough to get people to buy more of something? Or might you need some other incentives, including perhaps behavioural nudges or some form of regulation to change people's behaviour? Key question, well, actually two questions in the second bit. How much does the subsidy cost and who benefits? So is a subsidy partly self-financing? Will it create in its wake more tax revenue, which helps to cover the cost of the subsidy? Or are subsidies so expensive that taxpayers end up paying more direct and indirect taxes over the years? And thirdly, does the subsidy help to correct a market failure? Does a subsidy genuinely help to address one or more market failures? So offering tax-free childcare for families, form of subsidy, is that an effective mechanism for addressing affordability issues in childcare? Offering a subsidy to farmers to produce more food, does that really address a market failure? Or does a subsidy perhaps lead to some undesired, unintended consequences, which of course would be a possible cause of government failure? So lots to talk about when you get a subsidy question. When you're preparing for your assignments, don't forget application, analysis, evaluation. That's what we've been through in the last three videos. Just time to mention the self-paced on-demand student courses that Tutor2 are now providing online. I'll post a link to these courses in the comments section of this video. Our courses, I think, are a great way of increasing your grade potential by improving exam technique ahead of and your subject knowledge ahead of whatever assignments you get given in 2021. And finally, we just take a moment to showcase our extensive range of printed workbooks for economics. Again, I'll post a link in the comments section. These workbooks are perfect, I think, for working remotely ahead of important assignments. Okay, there we go. 3 videos on government subsidies. Thanks for joining in on this set.